Welcome everybody to the Sig Network meeting for Thursday, October 13th, 2022. First up is Triage. Are we even going to bother with that one, Tim?
Let's not even bother. I'll just respond to Han's issue. That's the only one for Triage, and we can just proceed with the agenda.
All right. First up, endpoint slice utils and reconciler as a library. Akhil.
Yep. Hey folks, can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. Maybe I can quickly summarize what the issue is for. So I'd like to basically make a case for making the endpoint slice reconciler available as a library so that it can be consumed by other custom endpoint slice controllers. And basically, I think it's fairly tricky to get right, and there's value in sort of sharing a robust implementation rather than forking or re-implementing, which is, I think, more common now. Also, I think from like an endpoints to endpoint slice migration, it sort of makes sense because it's relatively easy to write an endpoints controller. And just from initially trying to find custom endpoints controllers, I was able to find a bunch of controllers that still haven't migrated to endpoint slices. And I think having a library that sort of does all the hard stuff would make that path easier. So,
yeah, I've talked.
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I'm not too familiar with the mechanisms for doing this, but my understanding is there are like a staging repository would make sense, but so maybe there's a better option.
Yeah, I've been talking with Akhil a bit about this as well, and I know it's not normal to expose any controller logic as a library like this. But I'd also say this controller is a bit of a special case in that it's something that, unlike so many controllers in Controller Manager, this is something that we're seeing implemented again and again with custom implementations. And we see, from the beginning, we designed endpoint slice controller with this concept of a managed by label, that endpoint slices could be managed by custom controllers. But then we didn't really provide a good way to make a custom controller. So we are already seeing examples in the community of using a custom endpoint slice controller or plenty of custom endpoints controllers that have not moved to custom endpoint slice controller. And the endpoint slice logic is more complicated than endpoints. So although I would usually be against pulling controller code out and making it a library that people can use, I am tempted to say that it makes sense in this case. Not entirely sure where this belongs or how we do it, but I see the use case, and I feel like it will make the rest of the ecosystem healthier than custom implementations that are fully custom would be.
Two hands. Okay.
So I agree with all that, and I see more and more things that are being designed that have to emulate this pattern, right? This is one-to-many pattern. So I wonder if what we really should be doing is generalizing this a little bit into something that can be used as a framework for building these controllers as opposed to being specific to endpoints. And I'm really reluctant to suggest it, but we have kind of opened the door to generics. Maybe this is an application of them, or maybe not. I see Cal. I know Cal's over there going, no, don't do it. But this is kind of what they're for if we can define the pattern in a general enough manner, right?
I think Bowie had, yeah.
I
just wrote a bunch of gibberish in the chat. So, yeah, I think like the thing that a part of the design of endpoint slice requires a certain kind of implementation to make it scale. And that was always the sort of hard part when we looked at any of the custom implementations out there, was like, how do you tell people to do the right thing? So that's my 2 cents on why this makes for a very compelling library. Generic or not, we should see, but at least the implementation.
Antonio, go for it.
So the question is, when you talk about generic, you are talking about controllers or endpoint slice controllers? This is 14.
I mean, I see the same pattern coming up where people want to do something, but they end up having sort of an unbounded list of derivative things. And we have to say, sorry, you can't put an unbounded list in the API. It doesn't work. Follow the endpoint slice pattern where you have this one-to-many child resource thing, right?
I don't think that's the request here. Do you think is that?
No, I'm saying, what if the request was expanded to say we handle that in a simplish way so that we could build the endpoint slice controller around that, and other people could build their own using the same base layer.
Knowing
and I have no idea what it means.
Knowing our speed, this can let users wait 2 years for this.
See, we just give it to Rob. We give it to Rob, and it gets done.
No, just to finish my turn, I added a comment in the issue. Is the Envoy project has a nice Go control plane project for people to do this kind of thing. So they import this controller. And my suggestion is this: is just do this endpoint slice controller as a separate project, and because if you vendor the code, as soon as we add feature gates or we add something, we're going to break everybody.
True. Very true. If I may, I think there are 2 components to the discussion. The first component is somehow consensus that this needs to be offered to other people because other people are either trying to migrate endpoints to endpoint slices, to migrate existing controllers, or writing net new controllers that somehow need the same functionality. What is confusing to me, and I think it's confusing us, is the totality of which we are using the word controller. We are saying the entire thing needs to be vendored out and then people can reuse it, which, let's face it, if people need to have the same exact functionality, then just use the thing as is. So the question I'm asking everybody is, are we looking for set of helper functions? Let's say filter out dead endpoints, filter out terminating endpoints, all the little pieces that Rob has in his code, all right, that are used, and the people who are building a loop can reuse these helpers, and that way they can compose the logic any way they want? Or are we looking for a controller, the loop itself, right, with hooks that people can register callbacks in and say, okay, I'm about to add this endpoint, and then people can intercept this call, filter out whatever they come back and say, oh, don't add it or add it. And that way the base implementation is the same, and the controller manager register hooks into that controller, and everybody else want to use the loop, right? The watching, the ordering, the compat, like everything we're doing, it's just the hooks that they need to implement is this. So that way we can evolve the base implementation knowing it's an interface that everybody can reuse. So 2 levels of reuse, either helpers, set of helpers people can reuse, or a loop with some sort of hooks people can register in. That sounds to me like probably, but definitely not all. Like all of it is not like that will break, as Antonio said, immediately, because once we evolve the thing, we break everybody. And we will evolve the thing, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think those are good thoughts, and I especially want to call out the idea of we need to leave room for feature gates. Like, we know things will change. We need to think about where those feature gates may fit in and allow, upstream endpoint slice controller to continue to do that, even if we expose some of the common functions like reconciler to do that. So the use cases I'm most familiar with are things like implementing multi-cluster services, right? So you're trying to pull endpoints from a different source than endpoint slice controller itself is familiar with. So the overall logic is similar, but your source of data is completely different. And so basically, although the actual controller code may vary, it's all calling out to the same kind of reconciler. Now, endpoint slice controller is almost entirely built with logic inside a reconciler idea, right? And so all your informers, they call out to, when a new service is added, you call out to a method on reconcile, add server. I forget the specifics, but that's the idea. So that is a concept that is relatively easy to pull out into a library. But if we do that, we need to be very, very careful to ensure that we still have room to add new features and not completely break this reconciler pattern. So not entirely sure what that looks like. But I agree that we need to have that room with whatever we do.
It could play into KPNG. I mean, from what I'm seeing, like we could just implement this in KPNG. I know Lars posted an issue he has there. Maybe we can track it there and see if there's correlations.
How would that work?
So, I mean, the original ask, right, is basically looking at exporting some common code into a library that everyone wants to use. Like, we're going to run into the same thing with KPNG. So now we have two libraries, and we can talk about this more on the next topic, but like the two options there are, right, move those. I don't really care what the libraries do, right? But we need to figure out where they live. Like, are they going to live in core cube somewhere in a staging repo, or are they going to live like somewhere else, right? In gateway API or in KPNG? Like, is that more of the root of the problem? Like, everyone's agreeing here that we need it. It's trying to figure out how we do it. That's the problem.
It consumes a core API, and to have the library not in lockstep with the core might be harder. But I do agree you should evaluate where to put it. For example,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tim.
I'm looking at you, Bowie. He's refusing. Okay. I was just going to say, yes, I agree. Having core controller logic out of the pseudo mono repo feels weird to me. Dealing with cross repo stuff right now in a separate branch, it's a giant pain in the butt, and having things in the pseudo mono repo, the staging space is nice. I think that everybody's sort of nodding, yes, this is a real problem. But the actual solution isn't as obvious. Is it literally the controller? Is it helper functions? Is it something else?
Well, what do you mean out of the tree? I mean, we cannot move the core controller out of tree.
In theory, we could make a new repo. Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Antonio?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, there you go. In theory, we could make a new repo. We could move this controller to that new repo and then vendor it back in, and we could build and run like that. That would be technically possible, although I don't think it would be sort of managerially acceptable.
Yeah, but that's the problem, and that's the thing that I want to say is people want what the people want to vend. I mean, if it's only the logic for reconcile, we can just remove only the parts that we want to a custom repo and let the people render from there and evolve that control independently of the core.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm reading the comments. Sorry. I'm not sure what the right answer is. It feels to me like there's a layer which is the reconciling a bunch of things into a one-to-many pattern, And then there's the controller itself, the endpoint slice controller and the endpoint slice mirroring controller, which could use that lower level, and that other people could use that lower level. But it's not clear I'm not super familiar with that code. It's not exactly obvious that it would factor well that way.
I mean, it
has a
sounds
lot
like.
of-
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, well,
I was just gonna say, it sounds like none of the options are either have precedent or are particularly palatable. Like it could all be separated out nicely into packages in the actual repo, and then people could vendor it in, and we could kind of have a understanding that we will get around to fixing things that break it, and then people could vendor that in. But we don't typically support vendoring pieces of Cube into other projects in this way, right? But then depending on an external library also seems problematic.
I think we're mixing the what with the how, right? First is the what, like first is
Kind
how
of.
we want to do this. And then the how, even if we have to step on somebody's toes, and we probably will, right? Like it looks to me like no precedent, we didn't do this before. So that does not mean that the options are bad. I'm just saying it's probably something we haven't done before. We can figure this out later on, but at least now we don't even know what does externalizing this look like. How would we offer this as something for other? We don't have a list of features or functions in this controller that would people need to change should they chose to implement something similar, right? Like Rob said something interesting about the data source is commonly something. So does this mean if we just offer the controller with an external data source, is this possible, like an interface somewhere, right? So I think we should focus first on how does what does this look like, and then the vendoring part, which is messy. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's not going to be straightforward. We can tackle later based on our findings. So I just don't want to conflate the two topics together because they are very hard to think about together.
Yes, I have to drop in like 1 minute. Agree. Vendoring something, creating a new staging repo and putting code there and then using it and publishing it to external repos is actually not that difficult. Nor is it sort of like a frowned on thing. Like that's what the staging tree is there for. So I have no problems with that. I think it's safe to say we agree with the problem statement. And I would be open to looking at, or I would be open on Rob's behalf to looking at PRs, which try to factor the code in a way that produces a useful library while still leaving the controller in tree intact and satisfying the needs of things like feature gates. That said, I have to drop off. Thanks, everybody. I'll catch up with you later.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone. I think Akil is probably going to be, I guess he'll probably start on some kind of thing. And we probably need some kind of design doc or plan before we get too far into this. Cal, it looks like you're volunteering to help out, and anyone else who wants to be involved, just
Right.
I guess we can talk on Slack.
So I'll start the doc, right? I'll go read the doc. That the code has been a while. I'll go read the doc and just imagine a version of a future, right? And my focus is not going to be on the mechanism of vendoring, but rather the mechanism of offering external features, and then the vendoring piece we can talk about later. All right, cool.
Great, thanks.
So the only last question I had is that, Rob, I only heard your use case. I'm sure Akil has a use case, and maybe there are others, and maybe figuring out what everybody or a number of people who use this code actually want out of it would go towards answering Cal's question about utility functions or the actual entire controller loop, etc.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to the use case that I have in mind. It's quite similar. It's related to multi-networking, but it's similar in that the thing that's different is the data source. We're presenting a different view of the world to the controller. The core reconciler logic is still the same. How the multiple endpoint slices are updated, that's all consistent. And I think it's certainly possible, but I find it hard to imagine a case where you would want to change that. Maybe there is a use case like that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I feel like again, the only use cases I've seen, and I think Akil, you mentioned a few others that in the issue that you've seen of custom endpoints and endpoint slice controllers, but largely the complexity of endpoint slice is in the reconciler, and I don't see people changing that very often. It's more just the input, and it seems to almost always be different inputs. But if there are other use cases that I'm missing, I would love to hear them now, as opposed to after we go through all this, like with the theory that we only want to change inputs and then someone wants to change something else.
Yeah. The $6 million assumption that we just made is the reconciler logic as is will withstand the future requirements from external parties. That's the thing that really gets like, yeah, well, sure, the reconciler logic will probably be used as is. The key word here is as of now. All right. So that's something also to think about. But you're right. Most people are interested as of now into different data source, or somebody eloquently said different view of the word. So I like that, but we need to think about the reconciler logic as well. All right.
That said, we got to start somewhere if we're going to do it.
Yes. We can start. I think we can start with something and then evolve it as we go. I think we've killed that topic.
Yep.
Right. Action item is I start a doc probably this week or next, and then next week probably, and then we huddle on that and we start moving.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, Andrew Stoikos, next up, KPMG.
Yeah, can you give me permission to share?
Yeah, sorry.
No worries.
Go for it.
Let's see if it works. I've had some problems. It's gonna work for now. Sorry, you're gonna get infinite. Okay, I can't see anyone, so if you're making faces at me, I won't be able to see it. But can you all see my screen?
Looks good.
Yep.
Cool, awesome. So we haven't talked about KPMG in a while. I think most people on the call know about KPMG, but we're just gonna give kind of like a quick rewind before asking for the community's opinion on like where we go next. So this isn't just me, this is like everyone involved. There's a bunch of people on the call today who is involved. So I'm just gonna go ahead and hop into it. I've stolen this from the KubeCon slides coming up for the intro, but we're just gonna kind of talk about what KPMG is doing for us today. The two main things I wanna emphasize is like KPMG provides an easy interface for new users to come and write service proxies in whatever technological piece they want. So now users can reuse the same bits, which watch the Kubernetes API and kind of write their own logic on top of it. That's awesome. It gives a really good developer experience for people wanting to write new backends. And then the other main value add that KPMG brings is like, it gives us the ability to have an extremely flexible deployment model. So today, the 3 deployment models we are kind of seeing is running it all in a single process, like kubeproxy today, kind of like a per node daemon. There's not a ton of rationale to do that. We just did that because that was what was working before and people are used to it. But future looking deployment models include like split deployments, single tier where you have a single intermediary between the Kubernetes API and node local state. And even further future looking is the split deployment multiple tier, where you have basically multiple tiers of KPMG serving global API until someone requests a version of the local API. And the pros of this flexible deployment model is like in large scale scenarios, you're now dramatically reducing the number of clients watching services and endpoints. So you're reducing pressure on the Kubernetes API server for like really large clusters. So those are like kind of the two main things KPMG is adding today. Are there any questions? This is like an open discussion. I don't want it to just be a presentation. Okay, I'm sure there are, but there's more. So KPMG today, since the last time we've talked to, we've added some cool stuff. We have some testing infrastructure And we also have some more backends. So this is a list of like the backends that are around today. They are in varying state of completeness. I would say Jay can hop in here, but IP tables and NFT are kind of the two most complete backends today. They're all running E2E tests and passing, I believe, all of them. But we're running in CI, so we can go look. We've also added a bunch more contributors. Like now we have 28 total contributors from a ton of different companies, and that's awesome. Like the community has been great. It's super fast paced. Everyone gets to add code, and it's been a lot of fun. I think I can speak for the community there. Like everyone's friendly, and there's not really any gatekeeping. It's just a good time. So again, like last time we presented, I think to SigNet, we didn't really have CI up and running. Now we do. It's pretty much there. We have a few more tests to clean up for some backends. It's really easy to just go test this out. Like one liner, you can go give it a try, deploy dual stack, single stack, whatever you want with various backends. We have two new backends that we talked about before, which is Windows kernel and eBPF. Go check them out. And the KEP has been under constant iteration. So the KEP is, I'd say, ready for another look from everyone here. So really what we want to do here today, and then this is some more forward-looking stuff. Feel free to look into it. We're looking at new tests for services and adding metrics. So more exciting stuff that's going on. So that's like where we've gotten to today. And what we want to do is make sure we figure out how to align with Sig Network in the future, right? We've written a ton of awesome code, and we want to figure out how, like, what y'all want, like what the community wants to do with it. And so we've proposed some options here. The first one, I think, is, like we said, we've called it YOLO. It's probably not going to happen, and that is, let's put all the code in tree, and it's a ton of code, and that's probably not going to happen, but we threw it on here anyway. And then the other kind of way we could see aligning in the future is splitting up all the work we've done into little bits and pushing it back into tree, maybe parts of it, not all of it, kind of whatever the community wants. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the last slide. I'll go back to that slide because there's a ton of words, but we have some short-term action items. Number one being, like, go read the KEP. It has way more details. Go look at the code and try it out. But yeah, so now I just really want to open a discussion on like questions and how we see KPNG aligning with Sig Network in the future. Any takers?
I have one question: is why don't you start to gather feedback talking with projects like Kubernetes or what's the other one that you said? Well, this installer COPS and all these projects to start people using the project as a backend, because as you say, the other thing is YOLO at all. I mean, you cannot switch something if we don't know how it is running at the scale or with stress. Kubeproxy is very battle tested.
Right, exactly. So obviously there's a bunch more steps before we start merging any code that we've written in KPNG back in tree or in staging even.
I think that's why we kind of
just
were like, the second option is more conservative. Like if there's fears, like, you know, the original time we presented, it's kind of like the original conclusion was like, get the test passing and get all the CI done. That's done, but we realized that still there may be some concerns. So like, maybe it's better to start with it just being like adding COPS to that other thing. It's like, have it a dangling option in COPS, have it a dangling option in Cluster API.
Right, that's the thing. If people start to use it, the other suggestion is talk with SIG scalability. They can allow you to run some scalability tests that they run with 1,000, 10,000 nodes.
Mm-hmm.
We would definitely do that if we went YOLO, because that would be the only way, right? We would have to do the scale testing, right? But if we go the second bullet,
you have to do it anyway, Jay. I mean, how do you? You have something now that runs. I don't know what SIG scalability is running, but runs. I think that they have one that creates a lot of endpoints, and in 1,000 nodes, you need to prove that you are able to run that test and to pass it.
Yeah, if we want to replace the original kube proxy. But if we keep the original proxy in tree and we're only using it as a starting point, we do the second bullet, which is using it for new backends, then there's no regressions. There's no eBPF proxy that's running at 1,000 nodes that's going to regress, right?
No, my point is the following: is if you are not sure now that you don't have any performance problem in your logic, in your current logic, then if you start to put this thing in production, maybe this problem is going to be solvable later. So you need to show these problems early before you want to productize. Because
I
if you
totally
carry
agree.
on,
Before we do the first one or the second one?
Any of
before
them,
you do
either.
anything,
Oh.
right now is
Okay.
because the problem that you have is if you now start to install it, people start to install it, and it works well in 20 nodes, 100 endpoints, whatever, and then people start to build on that, and then people want to use it in 1,000 nodes, and you detect that your algorithm for processing endpoints or whatever doesn't work. Then you are going to do. I had to do KPMG V2. Because KPMG V1 has a structural problem that we cannot solve.
Yeah, that's why we definitely don't. That's why we're kind of leaning towards the second option.
But it's running in. It's talking with this SIG scalability. I think that is feasible, right? I can help you with that.
That's
it
an
depends
action
where y'all
item.
want to go with this, though. Like, do you want like how we prioritize things depends on what the overall direction is, right?
Okay, well,
that's the question, right?
Well, I think scale testing is regardless important. Like that's on the docket. It's something we need to do. At the end of the day, like there's two problems here. Like one is new developers don't want to rewrite all of this existing logic to write a new backend. Like they want it to be easy. So, KPMG has kind of solved that. And we could move just those bits into staging and provide a library, right? And then the second part KPMG solves is the deployment, right? And maybe we don't move those bits in right away, but we're just trying to figure out like what Sig Network thinks is the best one. Like scale testing, regardless, we got to do it. I agree with Antonio on that. And reaching out to Sig Scalability is probably the best next step for that. But apart from that, talking explicitly about like what to do with all this code.
Somebody is moderating. There are two hands.
I don't know who's first. Lars, Carl, Cal.
So I guess we're agreeing that in some future version of Kubernetes we'll have this instead of the current kube proxy. Getting there is the question we're asking right now. Right. And while we're thinking about it from a dev standpoint, I want you to think about it from operation standpoint. There is just ton of things written today that babysit Kubernetes, babysit proxy, babysit what proxy does, checks endpoint, checks IP tables. There is a huge investment done by the community around kube proxy. And that investment is not code, it's just operational tool chains, all right? People just, let's face it, kube proxy is not exactly the greatest ever, but people learned how to live with it, right? Now, if we come and say we have the second next break, like greatest things in slice spread, we first need to take all the current things that proxy does. You said it, the scale, perf, all of that stuff, the functional stability and all that stuff needs to be settled before we even tell people that you can use that. Mm-hmm. The second thing we need to do is, I don't think this is a function of Kubernetes per se, but it's a function of going to kube ADM or kops or even kind to go and say, let's provide this an option as an option and keep it as a second replacement for kubeproxy for as long as it takes. All right. And then we can start, then from there, we can start saying, we're going to build it as part of the release cuts and all of that stuff and provide it, and then people can make a choice. And then by then we can start the deprecation process for current proxy and move away from it. But that's not something that is weeks or even months. We're talking good 2 years maybe to just get there if we started now.
100%. And that's why I think with this second option, it's like, why can't we move some of the shared functionality that people really want? Which is like, you know, at the very beginning of this, it was like, do we provide a library in Core Cube to make this simple, or do we provide KPNG? And at the time we went and Mikhail made KPNG, and it's totally separate. But like, there is a world where we start with just, like I said here, diff store and server. And diff store is basically kubeproxy service and endpoints tracker. And then so you move like little bits that are shared between KPNG and kubeproxy to start. And then in the future, you can decide if you need flexible deployments, go use KPNG. If you don't care at all about the deployment because you're not going to hit those scale problems, use the existing thing we have. But there is still some shared bits between the two, right? It's not as dramatic of a transition.
So can you go back to the slide that has the diagram on it?
Sure.
I'm sorry for Lars and Bowie, I just hijacked that discussion for a bit. So the KPNG in the middle, those are new components. Those are new control plane components, right?
Yes.
The service store and the KPNG.
Mm-hmm.
So we cannot even say, oh, here is the cube. Those components are running independently from the existing control plane components, right? They're not part of, let's say, a scheduler or control manager API server. They are just standalone executables. They run on their own pods and so on, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking maybe a different path would be converting current kubeproxy as a backend. But that can happen without obviously these two services, which means people, again, touching on the operational tool chain is the one that usually
we kind of
scales.
already did that. I mean, IP tables, user space, like it's basically the kubeproxy code, copy and paste it.
Yeah, we just
I know.
rigged it in there so that it was stable. So, because one of the concerns, right, was that, well, if we have some new IP tables implementation, who's going to ever use it? So for IP tables, we literally just took the exact implementation. It still uses the caches and everything. Just because,
No,
you know, yeah.
my point is, if let's say we had a feature flag in Kubernetes that either kubeproxy or KPNG, just assume that this is the future we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
From a code perspective, it's a bit of work, but it's a lot of work from the operational perspective, because people used to think of Kubernetes as control plane as scheduler, control manager, API server, and etcd. Now we're telling them, oh no, you need all of the stuff that you used to, in addition to 2 more services, which is might not be a lot of work, but don't just operationally, people don't like to be surprised. That's for sure, right? That's something that I know. And feature flags for these things is really hard because you're running either this or that. So it's probably not a good path for the future. I don't have a clean solution for this.
I feel like we haven't really clarified the question very well. Like, Andrew, I think we need to like clarify, like what we really need is like what we're really wondering is like, what is the ideal direction to go? Like, because we could not put this in tree, and that
we're saying we have a ton of code and we know that it makes no sense for all that code to go in tree, but that maybe it makes sense to incrementally pull new bits we've done in KPNG and put some of it in tree, and that some of it can be shared at first between the existing kubeproxy and KPNG.
That sounds smart to me, but then also I really like Cal's point around let's try to get this stuff into kubeadm kind, etc. as options.
Yes,
because I think that'll help shake out a lot of the issues if there are any.
Yeah. That's a really
we-
good
we-
suggestion.
but we can't get anything into kubeadm and like we've kind of talked to them and they're down with that. We need some kind of a like we would need some kind of a, what would the word be for it? Like we need some kind of an agreement in terms of what the direction was before we jam that code into kubeadm, which is why it goes back to the whole like, do we want to replace the kube proxy? Or do we maybe want this to live as a separate thing? And either way, we could do those options, but we need to be able to tell them what's of those two bullets, which direction do we want to go in? Are we making a proxy?
I think it's even
aftermarket
easier
stuff?
than that. I think it's even easier than that. Like, let's not even talk about the proxy. Like, I think we can all agree, regardless of the implementation, that folks want to be able to come and write their own backends, right? Does anyone not agree with that?
I would.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
we can do that.
It's a niche use case. Yeah, I just want to bring your attention that Bowie and Lars had their hands up.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah, I
thing.
was about
Lars
to
and
do that
Bobby
too.
were trying to talk for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Let's go with Lars.
Yeah.
Thanks for waiting.
No problem. I want to say that I have from the start viewed Keping as a way of extending the network functionality in Kubernetes, because I believe kubeproxy is never going to change. So no new features will be accepted. It's totally super stable, and everybody who needs just the things that are present do not want to change. But I believe that Keping can offer things that people want. So it will like promote itself over time. So for instance, this feature of having an all IP target. So everything to a certain address goes to one pod. That is something I believe gaming industry and such wants, and that was basically blocked in kubeproxy, but it can super easily be done in Keping, and those people would start to have Keping as a specialized proxier, but then it becomes more and more of these specialized proxier, and then they will say, why don't we take Keping as the main proxy and have like 10 backends for it? So I believe in time it will promote itself.
Lars, can I go?
Yep.
So I think there's two things. One of them is that this has happened before, but I think the situation is different. So what happened is there's kubedns and core DNS, and core DNS basically replaced kubedns. Where it's different is I think kubeproxy and basically whatever replaces kubeproxy functionality has a tighter coupling potentially to Kubernetes than kubedns does. Although we can see like how good is the conformance test, how good are the sort of behavioral gates that we have, so that we can figure out if it is a drop-in replacement. The other thing is, as with most things, a lot of the difficulties will be around defining what the release cycle will be, how to package it, how to test that the basically core is not broken. Because right now it's very clear, since it's part of the monolithic repo, right? Like you can't get out of sync, you can't do a release that's out of sync, you can't introduce a feature and then have like kind of unexpected behavior. So in my mind, like really which path we go really needs to first consider like what are the gates that we have to demonstrate to be confident that, and just write them down. Like if we pass this gate, then we know that at least it can be a replacement in kubeadm. If you pass this gate, then we can think about it as like a, start entertaining it as like a core replacement, which is kind of what happened for core DNS, is that actually the DNS specification was written partially as a way to enable core DNS to become a DNS provider for Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's a really good look. I know Cal in the chat said it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping, because
I think he's
KPMG
kind of
adds
saying
more
this
control plane
sounds similar.
components. Yeah.
The last sentence, can you just repeat it again, Bowie? I just want to make sure I parsed it out right, because I think that's kind of similar to what's being suggested. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so there's two things. One is that the kubedns, yes, so Cal's point is very interesting in that core DNS is a task that runs in your cluster, and kubedns is this also. So it's like, it's a much better analog, whereas this one seems to have more moving pieces. One thing I'm wondering is that, are those moving pieces necessarily required, or it's more like a desire to move in that direction architecturally for the proxying base? Like, could those two be decoupled? Like, we have confidence in an implementation of KPNG from the code perspective that is independent of like, okay, then we have this like fan out architecture, right?
That's kind of what we're saying here, is like right now in KPMG, we're really locked into our two main features, providing the ability to write easy backends and flexible deployment. But like, those don't have to be coupled. Like, we can do whatever we want, but we don't want to live in a silo away from Sig Network, right? Like basically the whole point of this meeting was to start this good conversation and get these questions answered, and also just call out, like, come check us out. Like, let's work together. Sorry, go ahead, Kyle.
So the API server API machinery folks developed a new component, the proxy. It has been there for a few releases now, and it's quite stable and is used by a lot of the service providers. And I think they figured out the recipe of introducing a new, so they have they solved half of the problem we have, adding a new control plane component. So why don't we just go and ask them how that happened, and like, how did we allow this to happen, and so on. Another solution.
Carl, 1 second. This component lives in a separate repo.
Yeah, but people still get the release for it, still deploy it, still very comfortable using it. So we need to know the gates. I think Bowie said it right. What are the gates that we need to go through beyond the obvious one, scale, perf, and so on, in order to include this as part of the release? And it sounds.
No, the thing is, I don't understand what you mean. This is not part of the release. So what KPNG has now is the same that the connectivity proxy has now. Has a separate repo in a domain, in a Kubernetes domain. But those bits are not part of the release. Other thing is that it's being used in the CI because they just use that. But it's another component. It's the same as core. So all the examples that we are providing here is the same. It's just develop in a external component and make the people use it.
And the second part of what I was trying to say is, and this will sound completely dumb, but I think we should consider it. All right, having a big if statement in kubeproxy executable that sits on a feature gate, either load KPNG or load existing code.
So I'm gonna have to cut people off here because we got 7 minutes left and still have some more agenda. So I know, Bridget, you just struck out your item, but I think we have time for it. So if you want to do a quick plug, go for it.
Click on the PR from the docs and review it, and let's get this in. Thanks. I yield my time.
Okay. All right. Next up, Antonio. static pod for kubeproxy.
Yeah, this is a bug that I was able to reproduce. So the problem is when you have kubeproxy running as a static pod or as a standalone pod, it can raise in different conditions. But commonly, kubeproxy fetches the pod sider and I don't remember which, the node IP. So if the node responds and it happens that kubeproxy is faster than the kubelet on that node, it's going to fetch the old node component. So this is only a problem for people that deploy kubeproxy as a standalone or as a static pod. And well, I have the PR if you can review it. There is another subtle bug that it was considering delete events and for getting the pod side of that. That's it. And that's it.
Okay, thanks. And last item on the agenda. We have feedback on that poll. A volts. You're up.
Hi, I'm Andy.
Hey, Andy.
I sent this PR, but I marked it as work in progress. It's just it's an additional series of end-to-end tests, which sort of tests combinations of topology hints, internal traffic policy, and external traffic policy. I guess all I'm wondering, I think I worked a little bit with Andrew Saikim and the other Dan Winship. Dan Winship sort of advised that this might be a useful series to test. But what I'm wondering is, like, I don't know how this is my first test in Kubernetes, so I just don't know how the test infrastructure expects end-to-end tests to be configured, or which tests are run by default. If maybe I need to just ramp up in a doc or something, but these tests require multi-zone, and I tested them with kind, but I'm just kind of looking for information on how
we have a trick to run multi-zone. Rob Scott is in the call. I can explain to you, Brian.
Yeah, we do have that trick. I don't think it runs regularly though. Well, I think it doesn't run as a pre-submit, and we may need to start moving it to a pre-submit it as we're getting more tests, multi-zone tests. But yeah, I agree. We do already have a multi-zone setup. It is very, very specific. It's exactly 3 zones with 1 node in each zone, if I'm remembering correctly. So it may not work for everything, but it does help with these kind of tests.
Yeah, in the test, I think, Rob, you're on this PR. I know I just filed it, so I wasn't expecting any feedback yet, but I just kind of wanted to reach out about the approach, because some of the strategy I used was in order to verify that traffic was balanced across multiple nodes within the same zone when topology hints were used. I wanted there to be at least 1 zone with 2 nodes. So the cluster config that I was requiring was at least 2 nodes in one of the multi-zones. I also wasn't sure if I would need to make a parameter to ensure that sometimes the client was in a host network. I tested it both ways, but I ended up submitting the PR with host network disabled. So, I mean, the TLDR of the test is it somewhat rips off the topology hints test that you wrote, Rob, in there, and just sort of configures ITP and ETP alongside it, and checks host names based on curls from a series of curls from a client, which I place in an intentional zone. So I guess I'm just, the motivation for adding this test is to try to assist internal traffic policy being GA, and it looks like topology hints KEP has called out a need for some of these kinds of tests, so it just seemed like a useful test for a couple of KEPs. So if I'm on Slack, if you just want to reach out there or something. I think we've actually chatted briefly on there.
Yeah,
Rob, I mean,
yeah.
So
yeah, this is very, very useful. Your name looked familiar, and this is exactly like what I would need to do too. So thank you for getting ahead of that. I appreciate that. I am looking for advice because I've been struggling with this too. Like topology hints, to test it appropriately, you need lots of different cluster configurations. Like you're alluding to, you need a cluster that has multiple nodes in one zone, or you need some kind of random cluster setup. And we just don't have that right now. And I don't know how to get to that point.
You can play with tagging it as disruptive and stopping nodes, or just cordoning wrong nodes and restoring nodes.
That's a good idea. Okay, yeah, maybe yeah, I'll definitely, Andy, I appreciate your work on this, and maybe we should follow up with Antonio because yeah, that's a good idea.
Cool. No, thanks. I'll catch y'all later. Thanks for looking.
Look, if you want to add more tests, you are free to to take on everything that you want. I mean, those are always work.
Well, I wondered if host network was relevant, but we can just chat about it in Slack, I suppose, if that's preferred.
And
It
with that,
seems
we're
like-
out of time. Oh,
You
sorry.
can
Go
do
ahead.
zones with kind. You can do zones.
Yeah.
You have
Yeah.
a magic job. Yeah, you want to know where it lives?
No, I'm thinking we have multiple tests that depends on cluster shape in terms of zoning and other stuff. We're not really interested in testing data path. We're interested in the control plane reacting to things the way it should. So why don't we just add kind as one of the things that we only need a single node from the cloud, in this case, just a VM. Then we can
No.
create a cluster the way we want, test it, and then throw it away, create another cluster, test it, and that becomes some tooling for people who want to test it. I'm guessing other people would want zoning. Like I know that BVC depends on zoning and so on. So anyway,
Well, that's integration. I don't like the idea of mocking. Everything that you test in network with a single node always pass. Then you deploy in production and you have weird bugs. I mean, E2E has to be E2E. And the packet has to flow from one place to another. Also, kind is not really E2E, but I mean, it was serving us well. But I understand what you're saying, and I think that it's very useful for doing all these matrix of topologies, but I don't think that should be the only thing that we have to cover this. Otherwise, we are going to debug in production.
It's not the hell I'm planning to die on, Antonio. So I'll take your words for it.
Because I know. Okay, we're out of time.
We still need some guidance from you all though. Does anybody have time to hang out today or tomorrow to help finish like the high level direction we should be going in? Maybe Antonio or Cal or Bowie or anyone else really who has an opinion.
I can do tomorrow, but not. I have a doctor appointment. Where is your next KPMG?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow morning. Yeah, we got Friday. We can do
At
it.
9? At 9?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
should be there.
What we really want to figure out is, should we pin it as a POC and move on with our lives, or is there something that we can? And because that's the core question, right? And we may have like sort of not. We didn't really.
I'll show up.
We need an answer.
I'll show up tomorrow on your meeting. All right. I have a doc appointment at 8, so I might show up late. But assuming it's 9, but I'll show up and let's at least.
And when you go to sleep tonight, just think about what you think the answer to that question is, because that's all we need, right? We just need that one thing, like what's next, right? Like we understand large clusters and all that.
For a lot of reasons.
What do you want? Okay.
For a lot of reasons, primarily this is recorded. I won't be able to respond to that. Anyway, we're way over time, guys. So.
Okay, and anybody else who's got opinions, come and help us figure this out.
Come to the meeting tomorrow. Yeah, thank you.
Quick thing, if everybody has about a minute or two before you leave, Sig Network lunch at KubeCon in Detroit, if you're going to be there. Bridget suggests earlier in the week, or we can do it during the conference. Does anybody have dates that don't work?
I just know I'll be at the Contributor Summit and not be having anybody wanting me to talk to customers at the booth during the Contributor Summit. So that is my most solid time, but other than that, I would love to see folks. What day and time is the SIG Network update? I think Bowie is doing it and maybe
Friday.
Rob.
A bunch of, yeah, Friday. Yeah. We get
Friday,
the
like,
coveted
late.
Friday afternoon slot.
Yeah, yeah.
I will already be in Wisconsin.
We'll figure something out to talk to y'all. Like we'll ping you off. All right.
But yeah, for the launch contributor summit work, I mean, that makes sense to me. For folks who are there.
I'm not there, but I'll miss you all.
Not going to be there for Contributor Summit, but I will be there for the rest of it.
Well, we can do two.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
And
we
this
can
call will
do.
be
We can go
happening-
out all the week if we want.
Yeah.
Nobody here is a jerk. We're all cool, right?
I mean,
Okay,
So
fair
this
enough.
call happens again November 10th, I believe, if that is correct.
Yes, that would be the next meeting. Yeah, I put a note in the meeting minutes to say, don't come next time. Okay, we'll figure it out. Let's coordinate lunch and other stuff on Slack then, I guess. All right, thanks everybody.
well,
All right.
Bye.
See y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.